Hello, my name's Jock McLaren. I'm a psychiatrist and I've got a bit of a reputation for being quite aggressively critical of mainstream psychiatry. Well, my answer to that is that somebody has to be, but just to show you that it's balanced and that there's more to this approach than pure destructive criticism, I think it's terribly important to show that there is an alternative, and it's an alternative I call the biocognitive model for psychiatry. And at the core of this model there is a resolution of the mind-body problem, and I'll explain all this as we go along. Now, there's a couple of starting points that I'm not going to argue here. I've argued them elsewhere, but I'll just summarize them to remind you. And the first point is that criticism is the absolute essence in science. If you have no criticism, you don't have a science. You might have politics, religion, football club or an old women's club, but you don't have science. And my case is that modern psychiatry is highly antagonistic to criticism. The second point here is that mental disorders are reality. I don't have any time for those who say that psychiatrists have invented it to keep themselves in business, or that it's just social relativism or something else like that. Anybody who is mentally disturbed knows that it's true. The third point is that the mind is a real thing, and I'm again not going to argue this at any length because it's the basis of a rational science of mental disorder. And finally, mind and body are profoundly different, and this difference we know as, or traditionally know as, the mind-body problem. Now, to explain that, we go back in time a bit to the French polymath René Descartes, who died in 1650. And he formulated the mind-body problem, or formalized it. It was intuitively understood until then, but he formalized it in terms of two substances. That is to say that mind and body are intimately related, but in terms of their actual basis in any sort of rational concept of the universe, they had to be understood in terms of radically different substances which interacted. This, of course, led to huge problems. The notion that there are two substances, which we call dualism, leads immediately to the question of, if they're so radically different, how can they actually interact? Now, there's every reason to believe that Descartes was aware of this, and that he was probably moving toward what we would call a materialist position, which is to say that mind and body are in fact one and the same nature. But he was very mindful of the fact that Galileo had an unfortunate accident with the Inquisition in 1616, and probably didn't want to go down that road. Now, for psychiatry, this leaves us with the problem of trying to work out how mind and body interact. And there have been three classic responses to this: behaviorism, mentalism, and we'll use the exemplar of psychoanalysis, and biologism. Now, firstly, here we've got the psychoanalytic resolution of the mind-body problem, which is simply to ignore the body. Now, that possibly stemmed to a large extent from Freud's unfortunate attempt to write a scientific psychology in 1896, and clearly he didn't have the technology. So his project for scientific psychology was tacitly ignored by psychoanalysts. But their response is simply to act as though mind and body interaction is a reality, and mind controls the body, and that's all there is to that. And for medical students, and also, certainly also for trainee psychiatrists, I strongly recommend they read two books which are highly critical of the psychoanalytic movement: Frederick Crews and Jeffrey Masson. They're very important books. Now, on the other side of the camp, as it were, we have what is called the behaviorist resolution of the mind-body problem, and that was simply to ignore the mind, to look at the behavioral inputs and the outputs and just draw law-like regularities between those. And I've mentioned here a couple of very important names. We won't go into those now. I've talked about them elsewhere, but Wilhelm Wundt was an interesting character. He opened the first behaviorist laboratory in Leipzig in Germany in 1878, he was a medical practitioner. He'd studied medicine, but he was destined for the priesthood, so he then studied philosophy, and then had the brilliant, then worked under the great Helmholtz, who was a physiologist, and then had the insight to combine Helmholtz's method with the subject matter of philosophy, and out of that came the concept of behaviourist psychology, and that developed further under the influence of various authors that I've mentioned there. And an important book, a critical book, was Brian Mackenzie's little monograph on the limits of scientific knowledge with respect to behaviourism. And finally, we've got the biological resolution of the mind-body problem. Now, Western science, as you understand it, cannot account for mental phenomena. So the resolution, therefore, is to eliminate the problem of mind-body interaction by conflating or running together the immaterial mind and the material body. And once you do that, of course, the rationale is that you can then use the technology of modern biology to investigate the mind, and so that gets around the problem. Now, biological resolutions of the mind-body problem are necessarily eliminative. They eliminate the mind, essentially, and just say, well, it is not an immaterial thing, it is essentially a material thing, and we will investigate it using classic approaches of materialist Western science. But there's only a certain number of options available if you want to eliminate the problem in this way. And I'll mention these just briefly, only to show you that, or why they've failed. I've actually talked about them more in my other books, and if you want the details, you'd need to go there. The first one is mind-body identity theory, then there's mind-body reductionism, and more recently we've got, from the philosophers, functionalism, and I used Dennett's functionalism as the exemplar, and Searle's biological naturalism. Now, the mind-brain identity theory is essentially what you'd understand it to be, and it dates for psychiatric purposes from the dictum of Henry Maudsley, who was the doyen of British psychiatry in the 19th century, and he said, as a matter of fact, mental disease just is brain disease. And so what he's saying is that there's nothing special about mental disease, it just happens to be a special form of brain disease, and we should investigate it using the standard technology. Herbert Feigl said, mental states and brain states have the same reference, essentially the mental states just are brain states. And Smart, who's an Australian philosopher, said there's nothing in the world but increasingly complex arrangements of physical constituents. Further on, Jean-Pierre Changeux, who is a French neurophysiologist, says it seems quite legitimate to consider that mental states and physiological and physicochemical states of the brain are identical. Now, the problem with this approach is that the approach being that mind and body just are one and the same thing, they're identical. They're two separate things which happen to be identical. Norman Malcolm showed in 1953 that mind-body identity theory is essentially irrefutable, and emergent phenomena do exist, so that the properties of mind cannot be explained in terms of properties of matter. And more recently, people have been arguing very cogently, I believe, that codes and their symbols are not identical with their physical substrate. And since the mind uses codes, then they can't be identified with the physical substrate, in this case the brain. And biological reductionism is the dominant model today. We won't worry about biologism versus vitalism at the moment. There are two sorts of reductionism, ontological and behavioural, but they amount to much the same thing. They say that the properties or behaviour of a higher order or more complex entity can always be explained in terms of the properties or behaviour of the lower order entities of which it's composed. So when you talk about a car, for example, you've got the properties of the car itself, which are to be explained in terms of the properties of the engine and the gearbox and the wheels, etc., etc. So a complete explanation of a car can be given in terms of the components of a car. And so that's the same rationale for